When I was about 9 years old, I got a pet canary. I loved this bird, whom I named Doc. Like, what's up, Doc? Doc loved all kinds of music, including the classical music that my dad would play on the turntable. For my part, I was kind of in an Annie musical phase, so I would stand at his cage and belt out songs to him from the musical Annie. The sun will come out tomorrow, and so on. The best thing about having Doc for a pet was the relationship that I developed with this small creature. I would let him out of his cage for hours at a time for flying adventures in the house. With a lot of patient coaching and a good many lettuce bribes, he learned to trust me. He would land on my finger when I put it in his cage, or when he was out flying around the house, he would come and land on my shoulder and sit there. And this creature, who belonged to the finch family, who was in personality naturally as skittish and quirky as a wild finch, developed a bond with me. Marvelous. Probably the second greatest pleasure of having a canary for a pet after the relationship was listening to him sing. I don't know if you've ever heard canary song. It's pure joy. And it seemed obvious to me that Doc enjoyed singing just as much as I liked listening to him, more even. Little did I know that Charles Hartshorne, a published expert on birds, had come to the same conclusion a decade before when writing Born to Sing, an interpretation and survey of birdsong. Hartshorne had no quarrel with those who pointed to the motives of mating and territory to explain birdsong. But he observed that birds did plenty of gorgeous singing when they weren't wooing a mate or protecting territory, when there seemed to be no obvious practical purpose for it. His conclusion? Birds like to sing. Hartshorne's primary vocation was that of a philosopher, not an ornithologist, but his understanding that birds enjoyed singing touched both of those worlds. And incidentally, among the institutions that Hartshorne served as a scholar was Meadville Lombard Theological School, a UU seminary, and my alma mater. He was also associated with several Unitarian churches, including our sister church in Austin. Anyway, he is part of the process school of thought. From my introduction on process thought last week, for those of you who heard it, you may recall the understanding that life is fundamentally made up not of the stuff that seems so real to us, but of processes. It consists of a flow of events, droplets of experience and feeling. And this ability to experience goes all the way down to the level of subatomic particles. Perhaps the most astonishing statement I made in my reflection on the dance of being last week was that reality is more like a life than like a machine, that the whole universe is alive. Granted, the experience of a proton may be far less rich than that of a person, but there is some freedom and feeling there, nonetheless, in this school of thought. But what is driving this experience? What is the purpose of it? Process thought offers an answer grounded more in aesthetics, in beauty, joy, and adventure, rather than in the right and wrong of morality. Birds sing for the joy of singing. Perhaps atoms even enjoy whirling in space. Rumi spoke to these themes in the poem I shared with you, How We Crave Beauty. And I'm reminded also of a Maya Angelou quote that I have had posted on my study door at home for 10 or 15 years. Life is pure adventure, Angelou writes. And the sooner we realize that, the quicker we will be able to treat life as art. Novelty and change are part of this adventurous quality of life, and individual freedom is what makes it possible. The freedom of atoms and amoebas and people to behave in different ways and create new possibilities, new forms, new experiences. We each have our very own world adventure, like the story from Our Time for All Ages. Does anybody remember those Choose Your Own Adventure books? I loved those when I was a kid. I don't know if they're still around, but they would allow you to make a choice at key plot points. Will you follow the path along the side of the cliff? Continue on page 20. Or take the path that goes down into the valley? Turn to page 37. When the abominable snow monster appears, do you grab a weapon and defend yourself, or do you run? When you stumble onto the ruins of an ancient temple, do you stop and collect treasure, or do you remember your friend who is lost and return to the jungle to look for them? The books were fiction, of course, but they reflect a very real aspect of life. We make choices, day in, day out, small choices, big choices, and everything that happens after that may be a little bit different because of the choices that we made. Now, our choices do not always bring joy, but there would be no novelty or change or enjoyment if we did not have the freedom which makes choice possible. The process thought understands this not only as something that human beings do, but as a basic property of the universe, this capacity of freedom and choice. The spirit of Blue Boat Home has that in it as well. It's part of what I love about that song. Sun my sail and moon my rudder as I ply the starry sea, leaning over the edge in wonder, casting questions into the deep, and taking in all the beauty of our wondrous blue boat home. Rachel Carson, who studied ocean ecosystems, wrote about this urge of life in the epilogue of her book, The Edge of the Sea, words that, interestingly, she also chose to have included in her eulogy. Contemplating the teeming life of the shore, Carson writes, we have an uneasy sense of the communication of some universal truth that lies just beyond our grasp. What is the message signaled by the hordes of diatoms flashing their microscopic lights in the night sea? What truth is expressed by the legions of barnacles whitening the rocks with their habitations, each small creature within finding the necessities of its existence in the sweep of the surf? And what is the meaning of so tiny a being as of the transparent wisp of protoplasm that is sea lace, existing for some reason inscrutable to us, a reason that demands its presence by the trillion amid the rocks and weeds of the shore? The meaning haunts and may ever elude us, and in its very pursuit we approach the ultimate meaning of life itself. This adventure, this urge toward diversity and beauty and novelty that is inherent in life, animates not only our individual lives, but our collective life on this planet and beyond. Process thought understands the adventure itself to be the cosmic purpose of life. The parade of life was evident before us when my family went to visit Big Bend National Park a few weeks ago, not only in the forms currently living, but in the evidence of the land of so much change and creativity that occurred over eons. We stopped at the new outdoor dinosaur exhibit, showcasing fossils discovered at Big Bend and describing the shifts in climate and ecology at this location over a span of 130 million years. A shallow sea once covered much of Texas, I learned, populated by swimming reptiles now extinct, as well as fish, sharks, and various shelled creatures. When the sea receded, a new environment evolved in Big Bend, a swampy coast roamed by dinosaurs and giant alligators. As the coastline moved farther east, rivers and forests came to dominate the landscape. Dinosaurs adapted to these new conditions, including the pterosaur, the first vertebrate to learn how to fly. The largest of the species, the Quetzalcoatlus, had a wingspan of almost 40 feet. And we could experience this firsthand looking up. They had a large skeleton of this Quetzalcoatlus, bones hanging above us. Later, of course, the dinosaurs went extinct. Mammals became the dominant life form. And eventually Big Bend evolved into the landscape of the desert that we know it now. I was reading books on climate change at the same time that we were on this trip, so I could not help looking at this grand history of Big Bend, not only with wonderment, but with some fear for the future. What will Big Bend become next? I wondered. How far will the desert spread? How many species will be lost? Will humans do what we still can to prevent the worst outcomes of climate change? The process understanding that beauty, novelty, enjoyment, adventure are a driving force in the cosmos makes a lot of intuitive sense to me, and yet it leaves open the question of why then we also have ugliness and harm and loss. Does it matter that we may be at the beginning of a massive die-off of species on Earth? In the cosmic sense, are these just blips in the unfolding process that we should disregard? Or is there some lasting significance in such losses? According to process thought, this does matter greatly. To explore why pain and loss does matter from a process point of view, let's come back to that Rumi poem. You'll recall that Rumi takes us from the idea at the beginning of craving beauty to the whole universe seeing by the end of the poem. Here are the final lines again. Try another way of looking. Try you looking and the whole universe seeing. Try you looking and the whole universe seeing. How can the whole universe see? Or taste, touch, feel, hear, have any senses, any experience at all? How can it see when I see? Well, let's say that we accept the idea that not only are people and larger creatures sentient, but that even tiny units of reality, like atoms, have droplets of experience, consisting of the most elementary feelings, attraction and repulsion, maybe more. This still doesn't explain the whole universe seeing. Rumi's verse implies that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, greater than a collection of separate atoms and creatures. And indeed, that is the conclusion reached by Alfred North Whitehead, the physicist turned philosopher and founder of process thought that I introduced last week. Extrapolating from the principles that quantum physics was uncovering at the smallest unit of reality that at least we can comprehend, Whitehead concluded that the sum total of all of those individual droplets of experience, all that sentience across all the universe from the smallest to the greatest being, is a superconsciousness or collective consciousness, a whole that encompasses all experience within one awareness. Now, a note about language. Process thinkers, including Whitehead himself, who had identified as an atheist, have often reverted to God language to refer to this phenomenon, to talk about it, even though what they mean by the term is remarkably different than the God concept of classical theism. Actually, I learned that Hartshorne had expanded on what he saw as the 6 errors of classical theism. He wrote a whole book about it, discussing how this idea of the universal consciousness of process thought was different from the idea of God that many of us are familiar with from our culture. So to avoid confusing these different concepts, I'm going to refer to this overarching awareness using the indigenous language of Great Spirit, or simply cosmic consciousness, rather than God. So the cosmic consciousness is made up of all the droplets of experience felt by all of the individuals within the universe. Are you with me? Okay, this is kind of heady stuff. It then follows that my experience, my looking, is the whole universe seeing. Your joy in holding a new grandbaby, my canary's pleasure in singing, the sorrow of millions of creatures facing extinction, it's all taken into this cosmic consciousness. It's all experienced by the Great Spirit. The joy and the pain of every individual, every sparrow, every canary, every person. Now, I don't know how all this lands on you. It's kind of a lot to take in, which is why I'm trying to do this in a series of reflections, but it clicked so much for me when I first discovered process thought. And I think part of the reason Well, some years before, I had read a scientific description of holograms, and I was struck by the hologram as a metaphor for our underlying reality. You see, not only is the whole hologram made up of all of its parts, but even the tiniest piece of the hologram contains the whole image within it. It may be a little blurry, but that whole image is inside each piece. And just so, every being that exists may exist within a larger whole, what some people call Great Spirit, others may call God. And what's more, every one of us may contain that cosmic consciousness within us in some way. These are the very ideas developed by process theology. And mystics of many traditions often offer testimony to such ideas from their own experience and understanding, as Rumi did and as William James did, as he spoke of commingling in the roots underground. So, Friday, I've been working on this sermon. It was a little long. We have other elements in the service, too, that are making us run long today. But I went out onto the deck with my pen. I was going to try to see what I could cut. And I was so surprised. There before me on the deck was Lizzie, our backyard lizard, sunning herself. It was the first time she had reemerged since winter. And I had wondered if she would come back. Like, do lizards hibernate? Where do they go? And I was delighted to see her. And so I kind of spontaneously, I went in the house and I got a little Tupperware lid and I put some water in it and put out like a lizard-sized dish of water for Lizzie. Now, from the point of view of process thought, my pleasure in seeing Lizzie and the lizard's appreciation of the water, if in fact I got that right and lizards appreciate people leaving them water, that all became part of the cosmic experience, both sides of that. And the converse is also true, that pain also registers in the mind or the heart of the whole. When a child is bullied at school, or when a young woman is raped, or when those with no way out are sent to the front lines to kill or be killed in a war, and when the poor are forgotten or scorned while the rich get richer, none of those people suffer alone. From the point of view of process thought, all of that pain of all of those people is also felt by the Great Spirit. Which brings us to that great theological question, but why then do bad things happen? Why must we endure pain? Why do we do hurtful things? Why not a reality made up of sheer beauty and light if joy and adventure are the drivers of the universe? And if there is a cosmic consciousness taking into itself the sum total of all experience? Because you can't have the novelty, the great parade of life on earth, the beauty and diversity without freedom. The cosmic awareness does not control the universe as the God of old understanding does. Among Hartshorn's 6 errors of classical theism are the errors of believing that God is omnipotent, with the power to directly control everything, and the erroneous belief that God is omniscient, knowing the future. Contrary to the imaginations of earlier humans, process thought says, the Great Spirit is not like a dictatorial king. Instead, the cosmic awareness shares with all sentient beings the droplets of experience that make up our life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So rather than a coercive power to make things happen, to bend individuals to its will, the Great Spirit of process theology has only the power of persuasion, and it operates inside us in very subtle ways. In the process understanding, the cosmic awareness is continually drawing us through our desires, our conscience, the sympathy that we feel with other beings, toward choices that will create more beauty and joy, not only for ourselves, but for all of life. The language of lure is used. It's a bit like the fishing lure that a fisher uses to attract the fish. Only instead of getting hooked, individuals who follow the lures of cosmic consciousness are moving toward joy and beauty and well-being for all of life. Now, since we have freedom and we are imperfect and learning ourselves, we do not always choose that which brings the greatest joy to ourselves or to the greater whole. And sometimes, in fact, we choose things that are quite harmful. Which leads to another of the great theological questions. What then gives us hope? I understand process theology as lifting up a sort of cosmic learning process that takes place over the course of time. That's where I find hope in this set of theological ideas, a cosmic learning process. The Great Spirit encompasses not only all of our experiences, but as an ongoing consciousness, in a sense, it holds the memory of the universe. All the experiences that have accumulated over time remain within this cosmic awareness, which means nothing is ever wasted. As the Great Spirit learns what brings joy and what does not, we, all of the individuals with some degree of choice and experience, are lured toward choices that serve the greater good, the greater joy. So if we want to speak of this cosmic consciousness and God language, this is not the distant, static God of being that many of us grew up understanding God to be, but a God of becoming that is right here with us, in us, through us. And we are a crucial part of that becoming. The adventure of life is a partnership. So the final upshot of process theology I'll share today, then, is that nothing could be more important than the choices that we make here and now, because that cosmic learning process depends upon us to learn and to follow those lures that are trying to pull us toward the greater good and the greater joy. And all of that learning starts within us as individuals. You know, whether we are focusing on our daily choices and relationships, or whether we are working to create more life-giving communities, like rooting out racism from our institutions, which is something we're going to talk more about here on May 7th. And it's true when we are striving for ways to change our economy and our life ways to prevent the worst effects of climate change. It's up to us. From a process understanding, as we learn, as we suffer, as we enjoy, the cosmic consciousness will be learning and suffering and experiencing joy right along with us. And the Great Spirit will be luring us toward a world more full of joy and beauty for all. Well, however you respond to these ideas from process thought, may we all be sensitive to the pulls that we feel inside ourselves toward more joy and more good for the whole. May we do our best to learn, to reduce suffering, and maximize joy for all beings, so that this adventure of life will be beautiful for all of the individuals that make up our mysterious blue boat home and this vast reality that we live in. Amen. I invite you to rise in body or spirit for our closing hymn, number 37, God Who Fills the Universe.